RealAg Live.
Hey, Kara Oosterhuis here with RealAgriculture.com. We are back here today with another Real Ag Live episode. It is going to be another good one. As per usual, please put any of your comments, any of your questions. We love to hear your feedback. This is why we do this, because it's so great to get that interaction with you guys. Now, let's bring in today's guest. I have here with me Boyd Mori, who is Assistant Professor of Agricultural and Ecological Entomology at the University of Alberta. How is it going today, Boyd?
Pretty good. How are you?
Oh, awesome. A little bit we were just talking before the interview started here that it's nice to have a little bit of a distraction as to what's going on south of the border. So we are here to talk about insects. Now, not bugs, insects.
That's right.
So you recently started this position earlier this year, correct? You were, or I guess
It
late
would have
last year.
been late last year, August 2019.
So since then, you have had the ability to do some research. What are some of the projects you're working on right now?
Well, COVID kind of threw a wrench into things, but at the moment we have a project looking at alfalfa weevil, biodiversity in alfalfa seed production fields in southern Alberta, and also investigating insecticide resistance in some of those populations. So hopefully there to try and get a handle on how widespread insecticide resistance is, and then what kind of beneficial insects might be in those populations to help control them if insecticides aren't working.
So was this the first year on the project?
This is actually year two. Sorry, it was a carryover from my previous position in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Um, and so this is year two. COVID put a wrench in it, but we're still continuing uh, slowly, but we're working on it.
So 2020, it's been a year on all aspects, but I would say it's been a insect year for sure across the prairies. What were some of the things that we've seen this year?
Main one that most people talk about, of course, is flea beetles in canola. Really heavy feeding pressure in some populations, especially checking out and talking to the provincial entomologist in Manitoba. There's some really huge populations there. Through Saskatchewan and Alberta as well, though, flea beetles were definitely on everyone's mind, both, especially, of course, early in the season. One that hasn't been on as many people's minds lately, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan after this past summer, is wheat midge. Wheat midge seems to be on the increase. Some things that weren't on people's mind as much as grasshoppers. We didn't see as many grasshoppers this year as in previous years. We still had some hot spots, primarily in the south. The prediction of a 2-year cycling grasshopper in the Peace and northern regions of Saskatchewan and Alberta seems to be holding true, whereas we didn't see high populations in those areas.
So is there any particular reason why like wheat midge was so high this year?
We just had really good growing conditions. We had the moisture when it needed earlier on in the season, which allowed the populations that were in the soil to emerge successfully. And the timing was just right. The crop was in the right stage. The boot has to be cracked in the wheat in order for it to be susceptible to the female laying eggs. And it was just kind of perfect timing this year.
So, of these insects, the ones that were kind of to watch in 2020, which ones will overwinter? If there's, if you've seen a field that really had some high pressure, is there any of these insects that there's a good chance you'll see them come spring?
Well, wheat midge is probably the one we know the most about. So if you had issues or in your crop this year, you'll probably have the carryover with wheat midge next year. Um, Pea leaf weevil is another one that's been on people's minds, especially here in Alberta and right now, actually around the Edmonton region. That one we're still gathering more by I should say, entomologists, researchers, not specifically me, but Dr. Megan Van Koski and at AAFC in Saskatoon and Dr. Maya Evenden also at the University of Alberta. They've been doing some work on pea leaf weevil now for a few years. And Megan's been doing some work to look at overwintering conditions and how many survive the winter. So we're still kind of up in the air on that, but research is being conducted. Some of our more, typical pests like grasshoppers and wheat stem sawfly, those things, we know they can overwinter here. And so generally speaking, the populations, if they were high in your field last year, they may continue to be high
So
for the upcoming year.
So something like grasshoppers, if they are coming in, like I know parts of the prairie seeing some fall pressure, and if they're depositing their eggs into the soil, they they will hatch in the spring.
Yeah. So grasshoppers are pretty resilient. Their egg cases buried in the soil. Most of those, generally speaking, will hatch in the spring.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I guess, is there anything that surprised you in 2020 when it came to insects? Like, was there anything that really stood out?
Um, wasn't really that surprising of a year. We had Dr. Kevin Float in AFC in Lethbridge. Last year, he predicted with a bunch of the canola that was still remaining on the field going into this cropping season, we might see outbreaks of this little ground beetle. It's an Amara species, which feeds on the seeds in the swath. And so that actually came true, where we saw not very much, but a couple populations where there were fields just crawling with these little ground beetles. And so we definitely had some pictures posted on Twitter. They do look somewhat similar to a flea beetle. So earlier in the season, people were wondering, and this was earlier before flea beetles were even active. People were wondering if they had a huge flea beetle issue in their crop, but luckily it was just this little beetle, and we didn't have any real issues with it.
Absolutely. So we have a couple questions coming in here. The first one is from Sean Haney. As he's not sitting in the host seat today, he's got to get his questions in still. So he says, what on earth are those box nets on the shelf behind Boyd?
Well, yeah, for sure. Those right there. So those are insect cages. So with COVID-19, we had to, I'm going to say a word that everyone's using this year, but we had to pivot and do some research at home. And so I had some insects that we were trying to rear out. And so I brought them home, and that's what's sitting in there. So quite a little fun, Kids enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's, I would rather hear the word pivot than unprecedented times. I think nobody needs to hear that it is unprecedented times anymore. So our second question here is coming in from Brianne Tideman. She's asking the evil weevils, and she knows I usually struggle with pea leaf weevil, which we usually just call the evil weevils, have had some lower populations recently. So what conditions do they like and dislike?
That is a good question, Brianne. Always with the good questions from Brianne. So kind of the research is still needing to be conducted. Of course, we've had this large acreage of pea and fava now expand over the years. So historically, pea leaf weevil was considered a southern Alberta pest. And now up even in 2018, it's been found in the Peace region. So we're not really sure of the conditions that are best for it. There's some thinking that the darker soil zones actually might be better for pea leaf weevil. But honestly, we don't really know. As I said before, like Maya and Megan are working on the overwintering conditions. Maybe, although we've had some pretty harsh winters, maybe the conditions were just right to allow them to overwinter, at least in the central region of Alberta. Down in southern Alberta, the populations do seem to be declining, but I can't really tell you what that is. We still don't have any parasitoids for beneficial insects against them. There are some ground beetles that will predate on their eggs and even the adult weevils, but we haven't seen a huge increase in those populations either. So it's a tough question.
Yeah, Brianne's always got the good ones. She doesn't like being put on the hot spot though. So remember,
Yeah.
Brianne, we'll get you on here, and it'll come back around. So the next few questions here: do you have a favorite beneficial insect, and most importantly, why? From Lindsay.
I feel like a little while ago someone asked me that, and I said syrphid flies. Syrphid flies. So if you're not familiar with them, and actually my students should be more familiar with them because I put it on their quiz recently, but they have aposematic coloration. So they look like a bee the adults, and they are actually pollinators though. So they're feeding on the pollen in your crop and moving that from flower to flower. But the larvae, they are in your crop. They're these little green maggot-like larvae, and they will feed on aphids, primarily aphids. So they're kind of just a cool natural enemy, but also beneficial insect because they're a pollinator. And then the larvae are predaceous on aphids in your crop. That's my go-to, I'd say, at the moment.
So then, to stay on the topic of your favorites, do you have a favorite insect in your insect collection? We all really love insects here at Real Agriculture, specifically Lindsay and Lara. So bear with us.
That is a good question. If I was in my office at the university, you would actually see my insect collection behind me. But uh, I guess I'm partial to things I've worked on in the past. The red clover casebearer moth. It's this beautiful. It's really small, but if you take the time to actually look up close to it, it's got these black antennae with white tips. They're also striped with white, and then the moth itself is this green and kind of purple iridescent color. So it's very gorgeous. Let's call it a gorgeous insect. Um, that's probably my go-to. And of course, I spent 4 or 5 years working on it, and we're doing actually some new work on it too. So yeah, it's probably my go-to as well.
So, I mean, if you spend 5 years on it, you probably have to either, I feel like you're going to come out of that being like, this is an awesome insect, or get out of here.
Yeah, I'm
So,
not as courageous as some entomologists. I don't have a tattoo of it yet, but
yet, when
well,
you do, you're coming back on the live and we are going into depth about it. So,
I don't think it'll get that far, but we'll see.
so we've talked a bit about 2020. Now, everyone's tired of 2020. What can we expect going into 2021? I know you haven't quite developed risk maps yet, but you can give us a bit of an educated guess on what the prairies can expect next year.
Yeah, so for my educated guess is going to be based off of uh, data and information collected by wonderful people, agronomists, and other industry reps. And of course, Shelley Barkley here in Alberta, who is our insect survey technologist. So the big ones, things for people to expect are probably, the annual problem of flea beetles. They're not going away anytime soon. So of course, everyone should be aware of those. New one, as I mentioned before, probably wheat midge. Wheat midge has been off our radar for a few years across the prairies. This year, the growing conditions were just right. So I think we'll see increasing populations. Interesting, when Shelley was doing her fall survey this past year here in Alberta, she found that the parasitism levels also look a little lower in the populations here. So, well, I think that's a really good one to pay attention to for next year. Other potential ones in kind of northern Saskatchewan, Alberta, I guess north central Alberta, as well as the Peace region, grasshoppers. I know we didn't have grasshopper issues this year, but we had some in 2019, and they do seem to be on a 2-year cycle. And Dan Johnson, a professor at the University of Lethbridge, is working on this to try and really understand this 2-year cycle. But we are kind of expecting that we will see higher populations of grasshoppers in those regions.
So Lindsay, she says she's got more of a serious question here now. She says, for farmers who want to do more scouting, what tools should they have in that truck cab? What should be around when you're going out to the field?
That's a good question, but insects are really easy. So you don't really need anything specialized. Of course, I'm sure most of you have, a shovel or a knife on you, or in your cab, so you can root around in the soil layer if you're looking for cutworms early on the season, or wireworms. Later, of course, in the season, it's great to have a sweep net, just a standard sweep net to sweep through your crop. And then in terms of resources, AAFC has put out a great field guide to insect pests and their natural enemies here on the prairies, across the prairies. So that would be a great one to help identify, as well as there's a new cutworm management guide. Both of those are available freely online, but also I think you can probably track some hard copies down for free from some of the commissions and whatnot.
So I know there's a range when you're out sweeping. What is your magic number when you're out sweeping for bugs? How many sweeps do you do?
That's a good question. I guess if I'm not specifically trying to estimate threshold, it's probably usually about 25 sweeps in a field.
Okay.
Um, yeah, that's probably my go-to. 100 would be great, but that's probably getting excessive for most people.
Yeah, especially when you got a lot of fields to get to. So,
And especially if it's canola in pods, there's all fun to walk through.
so fun to walk through, and if you got a little bit of dew on them, yeah,
Yes,
it's
yes.
good. So Brianne's got another question for you here, Boyd. She says, could you tell us some of the challenges of conducting entomology research?
Ooh, in the lab or in the field?
Oh,
So okay, I'm not gonna talk about COVID because that's just a whole other
that's a
ball
challenge
game.
in itself.
Yeah. But so I guess for us, a big one for fieldwork is variable populations. So although we do have some risk maps and some forecasts each year, we could set up a 3-year trial and we could not get the insects across all 3 of those years. I think that's a huge one. And it's kind of a joke in going around the research circle. If you really have an insect issue and you want to get rid of it, you fund a project on it. Because they usually tend to disappear. That's a huge one. In the lab, I guess insect rearing can be difficult. So if you have these insects, some of them, they require a diapause period or a cold period. So you have to also do that in the lab. So it could mean for wheat midge, for instance, you have to put it in a freezer or no, well, pardon me, a fridge, for a 4-month period to then have them emerge. And so if your fridge breaks down or if the conditions aren't just right, they may not emerge, and you don't really know why. So that's definitely some challenges and some difficulties. And rearing in a lot of insects, just in general, some of them we can use artificial diet for. Others we have to have host plants, and so then you need the facilities to grow those host plants. So that can definitely be challenging.
Absolutely. So, I guess looking at some of the research across the board, like I mean, you're up on some of the research that's being conducted as well. Obviously, you're going to find your own research interesting, but what's some of the cool research you're finding across either the province or the country?
Ooh, good question. Um, hmm.
Putting you on the spot.
I Yeah, I guess to stick with the wheat midge theme. So wheat midge is one of the few crop pests that we actually have some host plant resistance against with the SM1 gene in our midge tolerant lines. And so wheat breeders like Pierre Huckel and colleagues, they've actually found some other lines with some potential wheat midge resistance. And Tyler Wist at AFC in Saskatoon is following up on that. So it looks like there might be some different varieties or lines of wheat that they found that just don't smell right to the midge. And so midge avoid them. And there's some where the midge actually lay eggs on it, but then the plant actually kills the eggs, which is quite different than what we currently have with the midge tolerant lines. That's pretty interesting and I think highly relevant to the growers here on the prairies. Um, Haley Catton's doing a lot of work with wireworms and developing kind of monitoring tools for wireworms, along with her colleagues at AFC and Agassiz, Wim van Herk. And I know I just saw recently that they've been able to identify a pheromone for some of our common wireworm species here on the prairies. And so that'll be a good tool to help identify population dynamics and population phenology to follow the adults through the growing season and across different sites and regions.
That's really interesting for sure. So one of the, I mean, entomology, like you said, you're talking about beneficial insects, but I don't feel like we can talk entomology without really looking at what sort of work can we do as far as educating the producer on the importance of beneficial insects?
That's a good thing. And I think a good question, pardon me. And I think a lot of that is just this chatting. I think that there's been a heavy push recently to, consider the beneficial insects. There's been programs or like field heroes out there to just draw attention to what's in your field. I think that's a great start. So if a farmer is thinking about spraying, they're around the economic threshold, but maybe not quite there, maybe you do hold off and, let the beneficials work. Because when you're spraying, of course, or when you're holding off spraying, you're also conserving those beneficial insects. Of course, if you are over the economic threshold, you have to go. All right, it is what it is. Um, but if you can be conscious, of course, of those decisions, I think that's huge. We are still doing a ton of research on beneficial insects. We're trying to figure out, yeah, which beneficials are actually, the most beneficial. We have a lot of general predators here on the prairies, things like ladybugs, the syrphid fly I mentioned earlier, lacewings, lots of ground beetles, rove beetles. So these are things we probably don't see because they're, around in the soil, feeding on our pest species when part of their life cycle is occurring in the soil. So we really need to know more about those. Sure, we might find them in your crop, but which ones are actually having the biggest impact on those pest species?
Yeah, and probably IDing them as well is a part of it as well.
That is huge too. I think especially with some of our parasitoid species, we have Bertha armyworm parasitoids, but we don't know if a Bertha armyworm is parasitized. You can't just pick one up and look at it. At least to a very untrained, like to an untrained eye, I would probably not be able to tell you if it's parasitized or not. Similar thing with alfalfa weevil larvae. There are a few parasitoids that are developing within the larvae, but we can't tell that by just looking at it. So figuring out if those species are parasitized is also going to be a huge area of research and would be really beneficial to a farmer. If you could go into a field and say, yes, you have Bertha armyworm, but 50% are parasitized.
Yeah, like how
I
that
think
would
that would
be
be huge information for them.
totally. So, question here. Last season, flea beetle pressure was so heavy that we sprayed 3 times in the canola field. Are flea beetles becoming more resistant to the seed treatment on canola? Is that a question you can answer?
I can speculate. So I can't say for sure if flea beetles are becoming more resistant. There has been noted tolerance in the past. About 12 years ago or so, Jim Tansey and Andrew Keddy, who was formerly at the University of Alberta, they did some work on flea beetle seed treatments and the neonic seed treatments that we were using and showed that striped flea beetles were more tolerant to the seed treatments. But whether or not there has been resistance or more tolerance building in the population since then, we don't know. That's kind of a bit of a lead-in question because we actually just recently this year put in a funding proposal to actually investigate that question. If flea beetles have become more tolerant to the seed treatments or where are they at now? Is it the same as before? Depending on who you talk to and if you follow the research, there does seem to have been a shift in our flea beetle populations in the last 10 years or so, where we used to have predominantly crucifer. Now we're seeing more and more stripes show up. And so we're going to try and look at the biology of these species too. And it maybe is that being impacted by some of the seed treatments that we're using.
Absolutely. So we're almost out of time here, but we're going to wrap up with one more question from Brianne because she's on fire today. Thanks, Brianne. Can you tell us about a future project that you are really excited about?
That's a good question, Brianne. So actually, I enjoy all my projects and my
I love
student-led
them all
projects.
equally.
Yes, I love all my children equally. But we have a couple projects that revolve around ground beetles in our prairie cropping systems and trying to determine in the field what are they actually eating. And so this might be up Brianne's alley as well. I think we've even chatted about it in the past. But so we're going to look at what insects and other small arthropods like collembolans or springtails they could be eating in your crop. But we're also going to start looking at weed seeds and are these insects also consuming weed seeds and what kind of impact might they be having on the weed seeds in your crop? So I think that project's going to be really interesting. We've teamed up with Dr. Chris Willenberg at the University of Saskatchewan for the weed seed aspects of that work. And then we're also working with Dr. Hector Carcamo at Agriculture and Agri-Food Lethbridge and Dr. Cale Frost here at the University of Alberta. So that project's looking really great. We have actually 4 graduate students working on it. Oh, and I would be remiss to say that we're also working with Dr. Maya Evenden and one of her students who's working in pulses and fava beans and peas, looking at a similar thing there. So it's going to be really cool. And, the amount of information we get out over the next 2 or 3 years is going to be, really exciting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. I always find it so interesting to see what's coming up on the docket for sure. Lindsay's wondering if you have considered talking to them sternly and asking them to leave. That solves all problems. Either that or just put it in rice, right, Lindsay?
Yeah. I
So,
like it.
yeah, absolutely. But on that note, we are out of time already. It goes by
Wow.
so fast. But I've really enjoyed chatting with you, Boyd. It's been great having you on, and I'm sure we'll get you back on here soon.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for tuning in. It's always great to have you along. Thanks for all the participation. We love getting to interact with our audience members. It makes it all the more special. If you are looking for any sort of stuff to do this afternoon, check out Rural Radio 147 at 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time, where we will have RealAg Radio with Sean Haney, and he even talks some election coverage and how it impacts Canada. So if you are into how it's going to impact Canada, you might want to take a look at that one. But like I said, thanks again for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next